Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. We're really glad to see you all. And first of all, we would like to give big thanks to our speaker, to the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher and artist and scientist, S.Friedman. And also giving big thanks to the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please make sure to ask your questions, give your feedback, and we'll definitely address them in the end of the next session. And also today, we will address the questions from the previous session. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for the introduction, as always. I also want to extend my thanks to the American Consulate in Almaty, to Elmira, Dana, the entire staff, the entire team that provides this platform for exploring philosophical perspectives on a wide range of issues. Again, as I always emphasize, a lot of these talks are drawn from international days of celebration or recognition, or perhaps something that's tied into a historical commemoration, some significant historical event that I think merits a philosophical interpretation or perspective or discussion. Philosophy addresses everything. It is the only field of human intellectual endeavor that does. It created the sciences. It created the scientific method. There is a philosophy of art, of society, sociology, of beauty, of history, of knowledge, of behavior, ethics, right and wrong. Philosophy is the one enterprise that operates from such a high level of generality, the limit of rigor, that it basically encompasses the whole. Remember, philosophy is something that not only deals with the highest level of generality, but leaves nothing out. So it's not modeling systems, it's not modeling climate change, it's not modeling physical systems where physical models present an abstraction. They are leaving out details. They are a view of the world at some elevation, some height. Philosophy sees things from the greatest possible elevation, greatest possible height, but sees every single detail. Nothing is left out. Everything is encompassed. Today's talk is not inspired by an international day. Instead, it's inspired by a conversation I had a little over a week ago with a friend of mine, the producer, actually, of the play I did in New York, Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World. Now, I've known this person for over a decade. We've had lots of conversations about the philosophy since he was engaged in not just producing Phalaris's Bull, but also helping sort of guide the script. He was a critique. He offered critiques of the script, so that I was able to produce something that was more assimilatable, more understandable rather than less, more dramatic rather than less. So he's had a lot of exposure to these philosophical results, these ideas. Nevertheless, about a week and a half ago, we were talking, and I don't know exactly how the topic came up, but we sort of revisited the issue of the philosophical response to human pain. Physical pain in particular, also psychological pain, but especially physical pain. And there have been a number of anecdotes that I've related to him over the years about the power of the philosophical perspective to control such pain. And his response was, well, this is something that hospitals should know about. cancer patients should know about. And I said, well, that's one of the reasons why I did the play, one of the reasons why I do these talks, to communicate the power of the philosophy at all levels. And in fact, in previous talks, I've addressed some of these issues, the power of the philosophy to put us in control of even such experiences as powerful pain, extremes of pain, not just psychologically, but physically. And I realized, as everyone doing philosophy, tends to realize, that the results are hard to assimilate. They're not easy to understand. And even when you understand them on some level, you don't fully grasp all the implications of philosophical results, all the implications of what I'm saying. Now, I try to approach things from lots of different directions. That's one of the reasons why I do these talks, from, keyed into different events, different topics, different subjects, to show how to provide routes of access to a central core of philosophical understanding from lots of different paths, lots of different routes. All roads lead to Rome. Well, all roads lead to a central core of philosophical understanding. But nevertheless, the results are difficult to assimilate and difficult to relate to various aspects of one's life. So I wanted to revisit, because of, I think, its central importance, the issue of addressing pain. The actual title for today's talk, Ameliorating Pain, Mental and Physical. And ameliorating just means reducing. I could have said controlling, alleviating, ending pain, if that's one's interest. Now, obviously, pain has a biological function, right? It alerts us to some dysfunction, something wrong that we would do well to attend to. But for me, the most important aspect of philosophy is the freedom that the limit of rigor carries with it. I want things to be voluntary. The goal of my philosophical work is to make every mode of suffering voluntary. If one wants to experience something, one should be free to experience it. But if the circumstance becomes overwhelming physically, psychologically, then the philosophy in principle should have the power to end it, to end the nightmare. That power is not something that I was aware of from the beginning of doing philosophy, but it's something that has its roots in an experience I had when I was in college. I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and just to show you, the streets in Cambridge are uneven. They're made of brick, they're made of cobblestone, so they can be a challenge to walk on, especially if one has, for example, a sprained ankle that I experienced at some point during my undergraduate years. Well, here's an example of what a street in Cambridge looks like. See the cobblestones? They're uneven. Well, I'd sprained my ankle, and one day I was walking down such a street and it was hurting and I was limping. Well, I decided to do an experiment. I tended then and now to take an experimental view of the power of philosophy, that whatever the ideas were, I wanted to test them. I wanted to see if certain claims really worked, really produced results, effects. So I decided to kind of do an investigation into the experience. And as I was walking, I thought to myself, well, I'm limping partly, maybe even largely, because I know I've injured myself and I don't want to injure it further. And so my limp is a protective device. The pain tells me something is wrong. I'm limping so as not to make it worse, not to exacerbate whatever the physical condition is that's causing the pain, right? Until it heals. Now, again, we do well to recognize, pain as an indicator of a problem. But I wanted to investigate the relationship between that idea that if I didn't favor my ankle, I would hurt it further, and the actual experience of the pain I was having. So I decided to try to remove from my understanding of the situation my sense that by walking normally, I would do harm. I tried to dissociate myself from that idea. Now, it wasn't something I was able to do instantaneously. It actually took, well, a few minutes, maybe longer. I don't really remember now. I read an account of it that I'm going to read in Phalaris's bullet, and there I describe it having taken a few minutes. Maybe it took even longer, but the point is, after some number of minutes, I was able to dissociate myself from the idea that walking normally on my foot would make it worse, would make the condition even more severe. Once I successfully removed that idea, a remarkable thing happened. And again, I'm being experiential, right? I'm investigating what might be the actual result of experimenting with ideas. As soon as I was able to remove the idea from my thinking that walking normally would make it worse, two things happened. The pain stopped, and my limp went away. I continued walking without pain and without a limp, having removed from my mind the idea that by not limping, I was going to make it worse. Now, again, I'm not interested in going out of my way to create physical problems, but it was an important experiment into the conceptual nature of the pain, the conceptual framework or ground of pain. And it told me that there is something in the nature of the experience of pain that relates to our understanding, our ideas, our conceptualization of the situation. And that by modifying that conceptualization, we could in fact modify the actual experience of the pain and other associated features of that pain, such as a limp. Well, after that experience, I began investigating more the relationship between our ideas and our experiences of discomfort. I was in Boston, I was in Cambridge. Winters there are brutal, very cold, it snows, it rains. At one point, just again to further the investigation, I would go outside, open my coat, take handfuls of snow, and just see, was it possible for me to control the experience of the discomfort? Usually by telling myself, no matter how cold I'm feeling, no matter how numb my hands, I'm not doing myself fundamental harm. And again, once I was able to remove that idea from my mind, the discomfort disappeared. Now, I was not interested in taking this experience to the point where I would get frostbite. I was not interested in doing, as I said, harm to myself. I was just interested in investigating up to a point the degree to which our ideas related to the experience of pain. Around that time, I was taking a seminar in philosophy. Every semester at Harvard, as a philosophy major, you had to take, in addition to whatever lecture courses, a seminar course. The seminar might be conducted by a professor, in which case it might have 6 or 8 students. It might be conducted by a graduate student in philosophy, in which case you would have a smaller number of students, 2 or 3 typically. I took both kinds of seminars. The particular semester that I was doing these experiments, I was in a seminar with a female graduate student. There weren't that many women in the philosophy department at Harvard when I was there. Certainly, there were not women among the faculty. I took this seminar with this graduate student partly because her ideas and her perspectives philosophically were very different from mine. Also partly because the seminar was on John Austin, the English professor, a philosophy professor of the mid-20th century, whom actually I was compared to at Harvard. So I was interested in exploring his work a little bit more. But in general, this graduate student and I tended not to be on the same page philosophically. And in any case, she embraced the work of Austin. Even though I was compared to Austin, that was not the philosopher that I really gravitated to. I gravitated to Wittgenstein. If you've been following these talks, you'll note that I've mentioned Wittgenstein on many occasions, John Austin rarely. So Wittgenstein has been like a major influence upon my work, Austin much less so. But at some point in the seminar, one day in the seminar, we were discussing some topic. I don't remember the specific topic. I think, because I was trying to reconstruct today what that topic might have been, I think it related to something about our perception of sound, our hearing, our perception of voices, the idea that in a party, for example, we're able to direct our attention to various groups, and then other groups will fade from our awareness. It was actually something, a circumstance that Kant, the great German philosopher of the 18th century, was fascinated by, investigated. So we were discussing that. And I probably was telling her about some experiments I had done, on that particular topic. Not the pain issue, but on our perception of sounds. And after we discussed it, she made a comment. She said, now I see the connection between you and Wittgenstein, that you're as experimental in your relationship to philosophy as he was. Now, that wasn't anything I had thought at that time. That wasn't in the nature of my understanding of my relationship to Wittgenstein's work. But the simple fact is that the notion of experimenting, testing, observing, seeing, and drawing philosophical results from actual experiences is central to my work. The testing of my results is central to my work. Well, it wasn't until about, it was a number of years later, over a decade later, that I began writing philosophy myself. It was after I had been to medical school, I had done work in molecular biology, and I had done a lot of tutoring. I've talked about in Phalaris as well the fact that, the great pre-Socratic philosopher Protagoras said, to do philosophy, you must know everything. Well, obviously you can't, but teaching many different subjects is the best way that we can approach a more rather than more limited understanding of a broad array of subjects. And any degree of understanding of any subject is relevant philosophically, as I noted at the beginning, right? Philosophy relates to everything. So I was eventually ready to write philosophy. And when I began doing philosophy, my interest was only in its rigorous aspects. I was only interested in writing philosophical propositions that took the form of aphorisms, concentrated philosophical statements that could stand the highest tests of rigor. It didn't matter to me whether these propositions helped us in any way. It didn't matter if they made us happy, if they made us feel better about any set of circumstances. It didn't matter if they helped us cope in any way with circumstances. It didn't matter if they had any relevance to our actual experience and challenges of human life. All that mattered to me from the outset was that they be incontestable. Incontestable in the way that the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past, represent incontestable philosophical insights. So the first book I did, Considerations on the Nature of Things, was abstract. It dealt with things like the structure of physical systems from a high level of generality. And in fact, the notion of generality was central to that work. One of the propositions within it, I think it's actually, that book has been copyrighted. I have it here, but it's sort of tucked away. It's not readily accessible. It's not on my computer. So I haven't looked at it for some years. But for example, that proposition, the meaning of the world is its most general representation, may be within that book. So issues of generality, issues of abstract representation, rigorous representation were central. And I describe actually the process of approaching and writing that book in Phalaris's Bull. A few sentences, let me recite them. And I wrote, first paragraphs, but within 10 pages, aphorisms, concentrated statements, verbal mathematics. The riddle of the world is an object. God is a skeptic, generating time. The style of Heraclitus and Pascal, Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, powerful, lean, intemperate, uncompromising, suffocating, urgent, definitive. I mentioned some names of philosophers there. Let me just show you. Here's a representation of the, again, pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus. Here is the 17th century French philosopher Pascal, who was also a mathematician, a physicist, one of the powerful minds in history. Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, who also was drawn to the aphoristic style of writing philosophy. It's been said that had he not written philosophy in that way, had he written instead, large, extended, paragraphs, carefully developed, he might not be remembered today. The power of the aphorism has been central to the ability of philosophy to command attention over the centuries. And Wittgenstein, I've often shown that image. And here actually, from Phalaris's Bull in New York, is an image you can see projected, because there were a lot of projections that were used during that play. You can see some of those words describing the nature of my aphoristic style and the implications of it. Suffocating, urgent, definitive. And when I say that, when I first started showing art, I was represented, and I'm still represented, by a gallery in Santa Monica, in Bergamon Station. It's an art center. When I had my first show there, a gallery director, museum curator, came in, saw poles suspended, was drawn to them, and wanted to mount a show for me, which we ended up doing. And as part of that show, I had poles suspended, maybe 100 poles, in the middle of the gallery space. And then I had on the walls of the gallery aphorisms of one of my aphoristic books, about 55 aphorisms from one book. One day, and this was at a local university, the museum gallery at a local university, about 60 miles away from where I lived. So I would drive out there and sort of oversee the installation of the art and just kind of see how things were progressing. One day I drove over there and I arrived, and the gallery director, his name was Patrick Merrill, was standing right up against the wall, kind of studying the aphorisms that I had written. And now he was somebody who was intellectual, he was philosophical, and so he was attuned in general to what I was doing and the spirit that was motivating not just the pole art, but the aphoristic, the philosophic writing. He turned to me and he said, you know, there's no discussion here. These don't permit of any discussion. They're like suffocating. Well, that wasn't my view of them. I mean, I thought that there was plenty of room to discuss the, things that the aphorisms were saying or claiming, even though I hoped, they wouldn't, again, lead to discussion. The point of philosophy, the point of rigor, the point of philosophy as Wittgenstein pursued it, as I pursue it, is to end discussion, to bring us to a point of clear and definitive understanding. So the fact that he would say, okay, there is no room here for discussion, these seem definitive. That was one of the most satisfying responses I've actually received in response to the aphorisms. And this happened early on. Well, philosophy is interested in rigorous representation. It doesn't care about application. It doesn't. Physics exists in relation to the technologies that it supports. If our physics does not allow us to advance our technologies, we will get a new physics. If our physics leads to bridges that do not support our cars, we're going to find a new physics. The connection between physics and technology is intimate. We can say, in fact, that technology is a test of our physics. The physics has to produce results that work. Our biology has to produce results that work. Our molecular biology has to lead to treatments and cures. Otherwise, we're going to develop alternative molecular biologies. We want that from our science. Science is heuristic. Its criteria of evaluation are outside of itself. It has to help us. It has to promote our interests. It has to lead to desirable results. That's not true for philosophy. There's a statement of that in one of my books. The job of philosophy is to establish the reality, incontrovertibly, exercising the internal criterion of an incontestable rigor. Standards of rigor may fall or may lengthen, and fair contentions eventually fall. What matters is what stands. Only what stands against all possible force interests philosophy. Well, so philosophy does not need applications, but after I wrote my first book, Considerations on the Nature of Things, which ran to about 300 aphorisms, concentrated statements, each aphorism, and I've given lots of examples of these aphorisms over the course of these talks. Each aphorism might take 10 pages to fully explain, explore, explicate. So 300 aphorisms might amount to 3,000 pages of philosophy. So there was a lot of philosophical content in that first book. But again, it was at a high level of generality, and it didn't necessarily have any particular application. But I thought to myself, again, as a test, as an experiment, if it's possible to develop this rigorous representation of the world, well, maybe if we descend a little bit from that rigor, we can successfully apply some of these results in different directions. So as a test, as an experiment, again, my relationship to the subject is partly profoundly experimental. I want to test things and see where they lead. So I thought to myself, let's make an application. Now there's a formal way of making that application. I describe it as introducing a set of arbitrary assumptions so that the application is not operating at the level of rigor of the actual philosophical representations, which means that it would have to be tested, whatever it was. The philosophical results, at their purest, at their most rigorous, don't stand in need of any testing. They're rigorous. They're independent of any possible future outcomes or contingencies. That's the nature of the limit of rigor. But anything less rigorous needs to be tested to see if it's going to work. That's why every result in science not being rigorous at the level of philosophy, has to be tested. Doesn't matter how convincing or compelling. Einstein's theory of relativity, as beautiful, as powerful as it seemed to be, as much as it impressed Einstein in its formulations, needed to be tested. And if it failed the tests, Einstein was prepared to abandon it completely. Well, so I thought to myself, what do people care about? They tend not, in this culture, tend not to care about philosophy, but what do they care about that maybe I can apply these high-level philosophical results to helping advance? Well, cancer. People care about cancer. People would like a cancer cure, obviously, as much as anything, right? So, as an experiment, I decided to parameterize the philosophy sufficiently to come up with a potential theoretical result that might, in principle, be capable of chemotherapeutic efficacy, power against cancer. And it's a process I've described before. I won't go into the details again today because there are other things I want to explore. But it led, this process of application led to an object that was, well, I mentioned convergence, right? Like things coming together to form an object. This result was 19 degrees convergent, had 19 orders of convergence. In general, 6 orders of convergence can create a stable object without going into the details of what all of that means, just to give you a sense of the scale, the numbers that we're talking about here. So I had confidence that whatever this was as an object could be effective. I didn't know what it was. But at some point soon after that, I realized it was a species of modified virus. And that development, that application of the philosophy to molecular biology did produce concrete results. I gave it out at UCLA and other places, and viruses that fell within the parameterization were subsequently developed. But the point is that we were not, at that point, I wasn't talking about dealing with physical pain, emotional pain. I was dealing with using the philosophy to help develop a technological application, a technology. Still wasn't clear. And I knew that philosophy had at some point generated scientific methodology. So the idea that it would be effective in delineating or responding to certain issues in molecular biology or medicine wasn't far-fetched. But it wasn't clear that that high level of generality could be applied specifically to the control, amelioration of human physical and mental pain. That happened by accident a few years later. I've also told this story before, but because it's central to this development, let me sketch it out again. When I was younger, had acrophobia, fear of heights. There is an office building that's about 25 stories high. It's actually in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. It's at an intersection that wasn't far from where I lived when I was developing the philosophy in its early stages. This was after I left UCLA. I'd come back from Harvard. So one day, a couple of years after having started writing the philosophy, I went to that intersection. Turns out there was a mall there, a shopping center. So it was a popular intersection. And as I was standing at the corner of the intersection, looking up at that building that I showed you, looking up, I would feel dizzy. In fact, that's how my acrophobia manifested itself. I could be on an elevation looking down, but as long as I saw ground, even if it was some distance away, I was okay. But if I was looking up, especially if I was on a slight elevation, maybe one level up from the ground, looking up at some high structure like that, I would get disoriented, I would get queasy, I couldn't sustain the experience of looking at the top of that building. It was too difficult. That was the nature of my phobia, my acrophobia, my fear of heights. So I was at that intersection and I was experiencing all of those physical symptoms, right? All of that queasiness, all of that dizziness, all of that discomfort. And then, again, as a test, as an experiment, I decided, let me run an aphorism through my mind. Now, at that point, this was a few years after that first book I had written, I'd maybe written 3 or 4 books. They were of increasing length, so maybe now I had about 3,000 aphorisms. At this point, today, I have over 20,000, right? But that was early on. But still, 3,000 aphorisms is a lot to choose from. I don't know why I chose the particular aphorism I did, but I decided to run through my mind an aphorism I had recently written: selflessness, how one acts not out of need. Selflessness, how one acts not out of need. And the idea is that philosophy is interested in identifying our presumptions, the claims that we make about our circumstance, about the world, that are not rigorously justified, not rigorously justifiable. It frees us from those claims. That's the power of rigor, to free us from anything that's not rigorous, presumptuous, a premature sort of claim about the world, about experience, about the nature of our circumstances. I have an aphorism: bit by bit, brick by brick, we dismantle the kingdoms of illusion, right? That's in the nature of the philosophical enterprise, to free us from our illusions, our delusions, our presumptions, our premature claims. So selflessness, how one acts not out of need, relates to that enterprise. The idea is even our needs are presumed rigorously. You can say, well, what are our needs? Our need for oxygen? Well, how do you know that exactly? In your case, I know that's an extreme position to adopt. Rigor is extreme. So, as soon as I ran that aphorism through my mind, everything associated with the acrophobia vanished, because the acrophobia was a protective mechanism responding to a sense of threat. I mean, at one time we were arboreal evolutionarily. We lived in trees. When you live in trees, you're living in elevated circumstances. You don't want acrophobia, right? But when you transition from life in trees to life on the ground, then you're no longer, over time, adapted to living in trees, and living in trees can become perilous. You're not as strong. We are not as strong. Our upper bodies are not as strong as chimpanzees, as animals that are well adapted presently to life in trees. So when evolution takes one in a direction away from one's ancestry, a phobia can help us stay on that new path and avoid the previous circumstances that we were adapted to but no longer are. There's a famous early fossil, I don't know, it might be 3 million years old, of Lucy. Lucy was a transitional form towards human beings. Lucy apparently represents a transition from life in trees to life on the ground. Lucy died of a broken femur. She probably died of a fall from a tree, because as the human race was evolving, we became less and less capable of living in those earlier circumstances. And so acrophobia, which is a common phobia, is an effective device to keep us out of situations that are now harmful, that we're no longer capable of dealing with well. So it has a protective function, but the aphorism undermines the presumption of that claim that height is something to be afraid of, that there is intrinsic threat to that. Now, obviously there is, but remember, philosophy is not moving us in the direction of survival. That's what heuristics do. That's what science does. Philosophy is moving us in the direction of salvation, a complete solution here and now, and independent of all future circumstances, which means it's embracing a rigorous representation. So it's excluding even presumptive claims as to our need under any given set of circumstances. In other words, that aphorism was achieving what the experiment I did with my limp had achieved. I thought I was hurting myself. Once I removed from my thinking the idea that I was hurting myself as I was limping, not if I were walking and not limping, I would do more damage. Well, in the same way, once I eliminated from my thinking the notion that heights, elevations provided a threat, the acrophobia, the response, vanished. That was my first experience with the relationship of the philosophical results, the aphorisms I was writing, the rigorous representation I was developing, and a power over human pain, human physical response. There's an aphorism, a statement in Phalaris's Bull that summarizes the direction of the thinking. We suffer not a reality, but a presumption. That is the ground of pain. We suffer the pain of cancer as decay. We embrace the pain of bodybuilding as enhancement. The outcome we presume decides the experience and the burden or transfiguration of its pain. In other words, we're not dealing with absolutes. Even physical pain is not an absolute, but as I had gotten the sense of way back in college with my limp, it operates within a conceptual context. And that conceptual context is vulnerable to an analysis of rigor that can undermine that conceptual context. And we may not want to undermine it, right? We don't want to be doing things that will, again, give us frostbite or make our ankle worse or, make it so that we need surgery, right? But it's important to know that we have, through rigorous representation, that control over even extreme physical responses. There's another statement of that in this film that I did, Torture, investigating extreme suffering, right? There's no more extreme circumstance to have to address than torture to death. And in this fictionalized account and this fictionalized exploration of severe pain and philosophic response to it, I write something that is another way of saying what I've been representing. And that is, let me just show you here. Okay, within that film, I have panels that are actually text. Here is the text by the torturer who is speaking to his victim. And he says, "If you knew that in an instant the pain will stop, will vanish forever, and you'll be left pure beauty and empress of the world, in an instant, if you knew that was the outcome, would you be in pain?" again, it's a matter of the context. Now, it may seem I am not speaking in spiritual terms here. I know that there are religious traditions, Eastern religious traditions, Hindu traditions that investigate the control of pain through various types of meditative practices, for example. That's not what this is. That's not what I'm doing here. Remember, these talks are about philosophy, about rigor, not about belief, not about faith, not about religious practice. They're grounded in rigorous representation, incontrovertibility. But the idea always is that even our most severe physical circumstances or physical responses are presumptive of the outcome, of what comes next. We can't know what comes next. So rigor is able to eviscerate that set of presumptions through which ultimately we suffer, even physical pain. Now, it's not enough to say those things. It's not enough for me to be able to say those things. I wanted to continue exploring them just to see if rigorous representation has that power consistently in the face of every challenge of human experience at its extreme. But I didn't go out of my way to incur pain, right? That's something that Buddhism rejected, that notion. I'm not interested in cutting off a finger. I'm not interested in burning myself just to see. The philosophy wants to, if anything, as Buddhism wanted to, deal with pain effectively, not go out of one's way to bring it upon one. So, but anytime I encountered a situation, I took advantage of it to test the philosophy. And to test the philosophy, again, not in relation to any kind of meditative practice, spiritual practice, only in relation to rigorous representation, often facilitated by an aphorism, embodied in an aphorism. Well, one day, a few years later, actually more than a few years later, about a half a dozen years later. So now I've been writing the philosophy a lot. And I was immersed increasingly in that philosophical perspective. So it had increasing power for me. Well, one day I was in my house, in my garage where I worked. It was my studio. I was doing poles, as you see behind me. And I was doing actually bases for some of these large poles. The bases consisted of steel slabs, about 1 foot by 1 foot, 12 inches by 12 inches, 1 foot square, and about 1 inch thick. I got them from a manufacturer, a steel manufacturer. So they were not polished. The edges were all very sharp. I had some tools that allowed me to file things down, to buff them, to basically make them, to polish them in different ways. But they were extremely heavy. And when I would bring them into the garage to work on, they were very sharp, especially the corners, like points. And the edges were sharp. And they were very heavy. One of those bases that I described 1 foot square by 1 inch thick weighed about 75 pounds. So they didn't move until I moved them once they were on the ground. Well, one day I was working in the garage. I was at one end of the garage doing something, not working on the base. And something came to my mind that I needed across the garage. Now, I wouldn't wear a lot of clothes, when I worked, when I painted, and I wouldn't wear shoes. I ran across the garage, right into the corner of the steel base, the sharp corner that went into the ball of my foot. Now, feet are extremely sensitive because they are our point of contact with the terrestrial world, with the ground, and animals in general are vulnerable to injuries to their feet, right? Because food doesn't come to us. In general, we pursue food. When you injure a foot and can no longer pursue food, you are in mortal danger. So we have very sensitive feet so that we can be aware of potential risks. The pain of going into the corner of the ball of my foot, going into the corner of that steel slab, was excruciating. It's one of the most extreme forms of pain one can experience in an instant. But it was an opportunity, right, to test the philosophy. Now, at that point, I didn't really have to run aphorisms through my mind anymore. All I had to do was say to myself, or what I did at that moment was the philosophy, which engaged it, turned it on like a switch, put me into the philosophical perspective that when I was writing philosophy or doing creative work, I liked to stay out of. I tended to do my best work creatively when I am confronted with problems. Within the realm of philosophical representation, the problems disappear. So I wouldn't work creatively within the philosophy, but outside the philosophy. But when something like that experience of pain presented itself, A, I wanted the pain to go away. B, I wanted to use that occasion to test the philosophy and its power over those extreme sensations. And it worked like a switch. Now, again, I'm experimental. I didn't know in advance. But by that time, I had reached the point of assessment of the philosophical results where if they failed to end pain, if they failed to do what I needed the philosophical results to do for me at that instant as a test, I was prepared to abandon the philosophy, to just throw it out. That didn't happen. It worked. And amazingly, it worked, well, not just instantaneously, but the pain didn't return. Now, let me emphasize, we're not talking about vague spiritual responses. We know that drugs, powerful drugs, can control pain. We have drugs that are thousands of times more powerful than morphine for controlling pain. So we know it's within the capacity of our medical interventions to address pain. Well, drugs are chemicals. The brain is a chemical entity. It consists of electrochemical processes. Thoughts are electrochemical processes. If a drug that's chemical can affect the electrochemistry of the brain and help control pain, well, an appropriate thought in principle should be able to do, or we can understand reasonably how it would be able to do such a thing within the context of our understanding of molecular biology, neurophysiology, the nature of the chemistry of our bodies, of our brain. So one doesn't have to invoke odd, or spiritual explanations. What we're talking about can be understood in concrete molecular biological terms. Thoughts have the power that drugs have because they both represent interventions into electrochemical processes. We just need the right thoughts, just as we need the right drugs if we're trying to control the pain of the patient. Well, again, I didn't go out of my way to do these things to myself, to have these untoward experiences, but when they presented, I used them as an occasion to test the philosophy. A few years later, I was moving from my house. I was carrying a metal box. I slipped down a stairwell. The box, again, I didn't have shoes on. The box went into the box was metal. It had sharp corners. One of those corners went into the joint of my big toe on one foot. It broke it. The foot went against the wall. It broke the other toe on the other end. The next day, my foot was swollen. It was black and blue. But again, as soon as that happened, I was able to say the philosophy. The pain stopped. And I was able to drive my car, which had a manual transmission. It had a clutch. I was using that foot. Now again, the point of these experiments is just to test the power of ideas, the power of rigorous ideas, and the relationship between our physical suffering as much as our psychological suffering and what we imagine the broader context to be, that philosophy can help put into perspective, even undermine, when it's in our interest to do so. There was an experience too in a dentist's. I went to the dentist once and I had a feeling, I was curious, could I deal with the experience without Novocaine, without a local anesthetic? I did. The same thing applied. In other words, I wanted to make sure that before I began presenting the philosophy more broadly and more publicly, that it was powerful, not just intrinsically any longer in terms of the rigor of its representation, but powerful, as I was discovering, in its applications. Power to help deal with whatever the challenges that a human being was facing, physically or emotionally. Every time I had some physical experience of pain, the philosophy was able to stop it, like a switch. Ideas can have that kind of power. Rigorous ideas have that power perhaps most of all. There were a couple of encounters around this time that I had with people within religious traditions that, now, the Hindu religious tradition understands what the ability of their spirituality to address pain. But within the West, within Judaism and Christianity in particular, that's not so. I had a meeting once with the rabbi of a prominent temple in Los Angeles, Stephen Wise Temple. It was a meeting arranged by a student of mine. His parents were wondering about this philosophy. They were wondering if it was a cult. So I told my student, well, find whoever it is your parents most respect. I will meet with them, explain the nature of these philosophical results, the nature of philosophy, as rigorous representation, not as a system of belief or ideas, but as rigor. And that person will then be able to communicate to your parents that, no, this is not a cult, this is philosophy. So he arranged the meeting, and I was explaining some of what I'm explaining today. Now, Judaism does not have this type of view of the nature of pain. Within Judaism, pain is something that we are vulnerable to, having lost the Garden of Eden through disobedience to commandments of God. We lost a state of perfection. We entered a realm of mortal distress and suffering. So, there's no ready amelioration to, in particular, physical pain that's recognized within the Jewish tradition, at least as I've experienced or encountered it. So I was describing my philosophical results to this rabbi, and he didn't know what to say. At some point, he kind of blurted out, "But I like my pain." In other words, within his tradition, there was no way to turn it off like a switch. The tradition didn't recognize that type of power or efficacy. And so, but he recognized that that was not really the best response to what I was presenting. And he called me up sometime after that and apologized. And he said, I didn't mean that. I take that back. But it was a just expression of the frustration of his circumstances, that his particular faith, set of beliefs, did not reach the level of rigorous representation that made pain a voluntary experience. About 20 years ago, I constructed my first website. I bought a computer just for that purpose, because I was working with somebody who said, you should really put some of these ideas out online. I didn't have a computer. I didn't know anything about websites, but I bought a computer and I went ahead and I built a website, and I got responses to some of the things on the website that would then lead to additional website pages when I would answer those responses. Well, one response I got to, again, content similar to what I'm presenting today, was from a theologian, a Christian theologian. And let me, I forgot to read something. Oh, it's okay. The Christian theologian wrote me, let me just show you something too. Here is what here's what the website pages would look like. That's an image of one of my pastels. And then I would write responses to inquiries or comments I would get. So this theologian, in response to something I had written that he read, wrote me, let me get it here. Thank you for sharing your article, An Answer to Pain. It was actually a page on the website. Much of what you say has merit, but I'm afraid I cannot accept your principles. From an Orthodox perspective, an Orthodox Christian perspective, pain and suffering are a part of this world. There is no escape from them. And then he goes on and says that, Christ entered the world to provide us with a way of coping, but not a way of ending that pain here and now in the way that philosophical rigor can do. So, again, that's why I'm giving philosophical talks. It has a supreme power that coheres with the supreme power of rigorous representation. Philosophy doesn't need to have that power over pain, over physical pain, over emotional pain, but that it does is even more compelling for the embrace of philosophy. We have to embrace philosophy, right? Philosophy is articulating the incontestable reality. To turn away from philosophy is to turn away from the fundamental truth of our circumstances. It just so happens that that truth of our circumstances, that rigorous truth, also has the power to put us voluntarily in control of even extreme physical pain. There's a response that I wrote, actually in Phalaris's Bull, also in the books of Joshua, to like the rabbi, to the Christian theologian. Belief builds boats. In the case of Judaism, in the case of what the Christian theologian was saying, he was talking about systems of belief. Belief builds boats. Philosophy drains seas. Belief, faith, not enough to address the extremity of human suffering. When Jesus on the cross cries out in despair, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Christianity has failed its most important test. The faith might have ended then and there had there been something stronger. It's taken 2,000 years of intellectual development to produce something that is the nature of rigorous representation. Now, let me deal a little bit with some emotional responses to the power of the philosophy to deal with extreme emotional challenges. The two that I think I'll talk about, we don't have enough time for me to talk about them at extreme length, but I want to allude to them. I think mentioned them before. I think the second one, not so much. But first, the adoption story. It's in Phalaris's Bull. When I was in my 30s, I discovered I'd been adopted. It was as challenging an emotional experience as I could have, because I was an only child. My parents were my world to me. They were the only people around whom I was ever fully comfortable, ever fully at home. The only people that I could be in the presence of and not have to say anything. Well, once a cousin of mine lost, I had a cousin, a physician who lost his mother. The physician came to Los Angeles from New York to visit because he was thinking of maybe practicing medicine after his mother's death in California. He met when he was here with my father and me for dinner. At dinner, we talked about the circumstance of his mother's death, challenges of his facing his mother's death, its implications for his relationship with his sister. The dinner conversation was about his situation and his loss. But after dinner, I drove him, my father left, went home. I drove my cousin back to his hotel. And on the way, the conversation shifted to my mother, who had died just a few years earlier. And I was telling him about how my father had disrespected my mother's memory. He was already having an affair with somebody else because my mother's health was compromised towards the end of her life. That he said some disrespectful things on the occasion of my mother's funeral. So I told my father, that I'm not going to talk with you again as long as you continue to say such things throughout the official year of mourning. And turns out during that year of mourning, my father remarried. I didn't go to the wedding. I acknowledged it, but didn't go to it because I was mourning my mother. I felt she deserved to be mourned fully. But I told my cousin that when that year was up, that year of mourning was up, I reunited with my father because he was my last family member, my last immediate family member. I had no brothers and sisters. My father had no brothers and sisters, so I had no first cousins. My mother did come from a large family, but she was British. Her family was all in England. So they weren't close to me because of the distance. So my father's death really represented the death of my family. So I had to reestablish an association with my father. He was too important for me not to do that. And my cousin said to me, as I'm driving him back to his hotel on the freeway, here's actually where we were as we were driving. That's the freeway. We were right about there, but it was at night, so it was dark. But it was about that point where he said to me, as I'm driving, so you never sought out your natural parents. I replied calmly. I didn't want him to know that this is the first time I'm finding out that I was adopted. It's as profoundly disorienting an experience as one can have. It changes everything. It changes one's sense of oneself. It changes the world. And in Phalaris's Bull, I recount how I went home. I went to, as a test, to everything that had been powerful in my life. The writings of Stoic philosophers like Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, Mark Twain, Life is Dream, Dream Better Dreams, Kafka, Somewhere Help is Waiting, the Beaters are driving us there. Meister Eckhart, the great Christian mystic of the Middle Ages. You are something among somethings, and so you go. Everything that had served me in the past, I tested to see, will this work when confronted with this awful reality of discovering that my world was completely different than I had imagined it to be. Nothing worked. Nothing made me feel better. I listened to music that had always consoled me. Mozart, Beethoven, nothing worked. Nothing made me feel better in the face of this extreme emotional challenge. And in fact, around the time when I discovered this, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times about the challenge of people discovering they've been adopted, making that discovery at midlife, not being told about it, not knowing about it from a very young age, that it was extraordinarily challenging to deal with psychologically. So nothing made me feel better, but I went to one of my aphoristic writings, opened it up to a random page, read some random aphorisms, not specifically about issues of adoption, but I guess in a sense, all of my philosophy dealt with issues of radical transformation, its possibilities, and undermining the presumptions that militate against that embrace. So any aphorism I read made me feel better in the way that no other writer, no other art, no other source of consolation would work or was working. I went for a walk on the beach, and I thought to myself, maybe it's time to take the philosophy really seriously if it has that power. Actually, the next day, I'd made an appointment to go to a psychologist just to get her point of view on how to cope. But after I made the appointment and I discovered the power of my aphorisms, I called her back and I said, I think I'm going to be okay. He said, well, look, it's really traumatic, to discover something like that. Come in anyway, we'll talk. So I went in, I had a 1-hour session with her. And at the end of that session, she famously, well, it's in Phalaris's bull, and it's famous in my recollection in my life. She summarized our experience together by saying, 1, you're not mentally ill. 2, you have in your life suffered a lot of loss. 3, I can't claim to understand your philosophical work, but whatever it is, it seems stronger than anything I have to offer. So maybe you could come back one day and explain it to me, which I did. But from that point forward, it was clear to me that the philosophy had preeminent power over extremes of emotional as physical pain. A few years later, my father was dying. I was immersed in writing philosophy. I got a call from my stepmother at this point that my father had lapsed into a coma. He was dying from metastatic cancer. It had reached his brain. I was in the philosophy. I didn't want to experience his death insulated by my philosophical work. So I removed myself from it, and I confronted his actual dying process from outside the philosophy, outside its, if you like, its protections. But then, sometime later, I was home actually, and I got a call from the hospital that my father had died. And for the next 20 minutes, I was extremely upset. My last family member now was gone. And we had gotten very close during the last years of his life as he was going through chemotherapy. But after 20 minutes, as a test of the philosophy, I said, okay, let's test it. And I started to run an aphorism through my mind, and it only took a few words, and like a switch, the pain just was gone. That's the power of rigorous representation. That's the power of philosophy at the limit of rigor. We're running out of time, but let me quickly. Philosophy works like a switch, not a prison, not a fixed point of view or belief, but freedom. It doesn't ask that you wall yourself off from emotion, but if the pain of whatever kind becomes too great, it's always there, always ready, like a switch to to end it and drive all the nightmares away. That is the power of rigorous representation. A power that I've tested repeatedly in my own life. That's why I'm here talking about these philosophical results. I can't guarantee that they will work for anybody other than myself, but if they fail me at any point, then I eliminate the philosophy from my thinking. And to this point, the philosophical results have not failed. Okay, I know once again I ran long. I have some questions from last time, a couple of questions. Let me go to them quickly. Humanism and religion values are opposite. They cannot exist together, or can they exist together? Okay, the first thing to say about this is, as we've seen from my talks, there's not just one thing that is encompassed by the term religion. There's lots of modes of religious experience, and some of them come close to the philosophical representations that also intersects humanistic orientations. There's an early aphorism I wrote: the limit of philosophical skepticism is religious salvation. So there's in Hinduism, early Hinduism, there's a phrase, not this, not that. That the ultimate truth is not this, not that. Well, that is similar to the philosophical enterprise of skepticism, where it's eliminating all of our false claims, our presumptions, our premature judgments or assessments. So there's a lot of linking, especially at the end of the process. The final formulations of Buddhism are things that can be supported by philosophical analysis. I've often said that philosophical rigor provides a logical foundation for the claims of religion and a way to achieve rigorously what religions aspire to metaphorically. Most of my colleagues think humanism and religion are opposite, but I think humanism is a universal philosophical category. Yes, again, when we talk about humanism, we tend to talk about the focus on the human being dealing with or responding to our circumstances here and now, as opposed to looking to something that is transcendent, that's outside the world. Certainly in Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama tried to respond to the fundamental challenges of human life, disease, old age, and death, humanistically, by a rational response. Philosophy clearly is only engaging in a rational response to our circumstances, but that rational response is able to provide the logic that supports religious metaphor. So as I've said, as I've talked about before, Eden, that powerful metaphor of a state of religious perfection, of a state of solution, Eden is a landscape of philosophical rigor. So yes, I see philosophy as being able to explain what is best in religion, but being able to achieve the results that religion aspires to, not through faith, not through belief, but through, again, and I repeat this over and over again because it can't be repeated too often, through rigor, through the limit of rigor, through rigorous representation, where belief and opinion and point of view and theory have no place. Okay, I know that was a fast answer, but I hope probably at some point I'll elaborate more. Maybe I'll devote a talk to that issue. I think next week's talk, I think I have already selected the topic for. It's going to be the philosophy of fire. Yes, I'm not going to tell you all that's going to be involved in that talk, but I think that will be the subject next time. So, Okay, well, I want to thank you all for joining. I want to, as always, encourage your questions, your responses. I hope you continue to join us weekly. Um, and I hope you find these talks illuminating. And I hope you find that the more you're exposed to these ideas, the more you're able to assimilate them and use them, to the benefit of your life and circumstances. And again, I want to thank Aaliyah, and I think Aaliyah has temporarily left us, but well, let me also again thank the American Consulate, and all of these talks are recorded and they're archived. They're accessible in a variety of places online. Most, I think, easily through Googling philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. They, I think, are all there. I've been doing these talks now for about 2 years, so there are probably close to 100 talks. And we've talked about how repetition is one of the best routes to understanding and mastery. So even when you hear like the talk like I gave today, revisiting this talk will provide even greater understanding and illumination of the ideas.
So, Stephen, thank you very much for your talk. Thank you for answering the questions. Now, I see we have a lot of feedback today. Thank you very much. We see it all. And yeah, Jason Hahn says, "Hello, Jason. This is a disaster. Uh, like the policy, okay." Then Yurkan, thank you very much, Yurkan, for joining us weekly. Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for interesting lectures. Thank you, Jürgen. And then the question is, what is the philosophy of life, will, freedom, and responsibility? How humans should be prepared for death? Okay. Uh,
Okay.
Thank you very much for your question, Jürgen. We will definitely address that in the next session. Thank you very much, Stephen. Have a great week, everyone, and see you all. And make sure to give your feedback and ask the questions next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you next time, Aaliyah. Thank you
Bye
again.
bye.
Bye-bye.